Hi, authors. I'm Tiffany Yates Martin. I'm a developmental editor. I have probably met a lot of you in the past. I've come to the conferences a lot. I'm really sorry not to get to be with you this year, but I'm glad we're all staying safe at home and that we get a chance to do this anyway. Just a little bit about me. I am a developmental editor. As I said, I've been working in the publishing industry for almost 30 years. I started in New York when I was an actor. I started as a freelance copy editor working for a lot of the big six, big five now. And then for about the past 12 years, I've been developmental editing. I work directly with publishers. I also work directly with authors, both bestsellers, New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, as well as indie authors and newer authors. And I teach online courses. I present webinars and presentations and conferences across the country, and I am a regular contributor to a lot of writers' sites and blogs and other media outlets. This is a presentation that the organizers asked me to create for you guys, and I really like doing this one. It's the 5 biggest mistakes writers make. It's things that in the last 28 years in the business, I've most often seen hamper a story from being as effective as it can be. And these may be the things that are keeping you from getting an agent's attention, getting off the slush pile, getting a publishing contract. So let's dive right in. If I can get the tech going, and I think I can. There, wait a minute. Okay. We're all having to learn new skills, aren't we? So, as I said, this is the 5 biggest mistakes writers make. Number 1 for sure is underdeveloped characters. Character is the heart of story. If you don't make us want to take a journey with these people, we're not going to want to go on in the trip at all. We don't care what's happening until we care who it's happening to. We're humans, and we relate to story on a human level. We tie into the characters, and we essentially ride into the story on their backs, inside their heads. We're behind their eyes, living this experience with them. So we have to feel like we know who they are, and that means we have to know certain specific things about them. Who is this person? That's more than she's a school teacher from Wyoming, or he's a former FBI agent. That's the beginning of who they are, but who we are encompasses everything. It encompasses our backgrounds, our choices, our personality, our ideology, the experiences that we've had, the disappointments that we've had. So when you read all these craft books, as we all do, that say you've got to develop your character, and they'll say things like, you need to know who your character's favorite 3rd grade teacher was, or you need to know why your character's favorite color is orange. I always would read that and go, well, okay, but then what do I do with that? So start asking yourself questions about what that tells us about who the character is. As you're working on all these character kind of like workshop questions, start thinking about how those things have shaped the person that we meet. This may encompass their upbringing. This may encompass previous relationships they've had. It's going to be their worldview. It's going to be their demeanor, their affect, who they are in the world. How do they relate to other people? Crucially, we also need to know who your protagonists are and what they want. That is your goal and motivation. It's important to know those things because that's what propels your story, but it's not always enough just to know your goal and your motivation. So let's say you need to know the big picture goal, but you also need to know what's underneath that goal. One example I always use is the movie Up, where the old man wants to get his house on the hill. That's his goal. That's his tangible goal. His motivation is because that's his wife wanted to be on this adventure. But that's not what's underneath that. What's underneath that is what I just put up. That's what drives him. So what drives a character is underneath goal and motivation. It's the thing that creates goal and motivation. This is the thing that if you get really good at excavating out, and you'll see why I say that word in a minute, at mining out what drives your characters, it will do wonders for fleshing them out and making them more 3-dimensional. So the example I always use, just as an easy way to relate to it, is you as a writer. Let's say your goal is to have a published book, to be a famous author. And your motivation for that is that you've always dreamed of doing it, and it's your lifelong career goal. Great. That gives our story some shape. It gives us a destination to aim toward, but it doesn't really tell us what the engine of that impetus is. That's what drives you. So the way you dig down and get to it is to just keep mining down deeper into what that thing is by asking questions. So you start with your goal and motivation. Let's say in your case, it's to be a published author. Why do you want that? Your motivation, because that was always your dream. Okay, now you start digging. I always liken it to digging a well. You don't just dig a shallow hole and hope you're going to hit spring water. You have to keep going down, down, down. So why have you always dreamed of that? Well, you grew up reading books and you love the way that stories take you on a journey. Oh, okay. Why does a story taking you on a journey mean something to you? Well, it's an escape. It allows people to escape into another world. Why is that important to you? Oh, because the real world is so mundane. Why do you think the real world is mundane? Well, because I'm in a job I hate, or my career is dead-ended, or I feel like I've always been creatively stifled, or I'm unsatisfied in my life, or whatever the reason is. Why are you unsatisfied in your life? Oh, because I always dreamed of being able to move people and change the world. And you just keep digging down, down, down until you find what that core drive is. Why did you dream that? Well, the world was unfair to me. Oh, why was the world unfair to you? And I'm making this up as I go along. The answers could be anything. The world felt unfair because my parents got a divorce and I had to go live with my mom, and I never saw my dad again and lost all my friends because we moved to another house. Oh, why was that so damaging for you? Because I felt unmoored from the world and unsafe, and I lost all my sense of security or being loved. So look where we've gone to from I want to write a book because I want to be published. When you dig down to what drives a character, you create this fully fleshed, real, three-dimensional individual that is specific, but because of that, it's universal, and we can relate to and understand this character. So start asking yourself these questions of your own characters to see if you can find the answers and let that inform the story. Finally, what shaped your character? That's basically your backstory. This is a tough one because backstory is hard to incorporate while you're moving the story forward. The holy grail of story is to keep it moving forward. So if you stop with this is when you get like your flashbacks, your info dumps, things that pull the reader out of that forward momentum. But we need to know them because what created your character is germane to who they are and the choices they make and the journey that they take. So start asking yourself the questions about, what was her upbringing? What was her past relationships? What's her ideology? Where did that come from? What did she dream of? What happened to those dreams? All those kind of squishy questions that are fun to explore for writers. Start digging down into those. And when you incorporate them, I always say, don't think of it as stitching big chunks of a patchwork quilt together. That's when you slow your story down and you have these discrete chunks of backstory. Think of your backstory as threads in a tapestry, and you're just incorporating them into the whole big picture as you go. So, when you are trying to flesh out your character, in addition to the questions I just asked you, here are a few others to think about that are equally crucial. I'm using The Vanishing Half because it's it is a plot-driven story, but it's a very character-intense story by Britt Bennett. Excellent book about two sisters who are raised in the same small town that it's a Black community, and it prizes light skin color. And they're born with very light skin color. They leave because they feel like it's a dead-end town. And then one of them goes on to pass for white, and one of them marries the darkest skinned man she can find. And then the story follows them. It follows their children, one of whom has no idea of her background. The other one who is born with incredibly black skin, and it defines her life in a lot of ways. So it's a really interesting character study. How does the protagonist reveal himself to the other characters and to the reader? So these will often be different. How a character reveals himself to other characters would be things like actions, behavior, demeanor, expression, affect, how they react to things, what they choose to show, what they choose to hide. But the reader will generally be privy to more of that. How does your protagonist reveal himself more fully to the reader? These may or may not be different. They often are. In The Vanishing Half, they're very different. We go really deeply into the characters, but especially the ones who are the character who is passing, she's completely shut down and hidden. So everything about her, the reader is privy to, but the people around her are not, which makes for a fascinating character dynamic, but also this incredible internal and external tension that Bennett builds. What does she hide? This is another question that can be answered on two levels. What does she hide from other people? Well, three levels. What does she hide from the reader, which may come out as the story progresses? And what does she hide from herself? A lot of times you have characters who are unwilling to look at their own motivations. They're unwilling to look at their own idiosyncrasies, their own vulnerabilities, weaknesses. You could also think of this as the wound or the misbelief. What is the thing that is the most vulnerable part of your character that she desperately doesn't want anyone to know and may not even be willing to acknowledge herself? This question alone is one that can really add a lot of depth to your characters. And finally, this is a great one for how involved the reader feels with your story. Is the reader inside of the character's head? Are we living the story with them firsthand as they live it behind their eyes? Are we thinking their thoughts? Are we feeling their feelings? Is it visceral, meaning are we right there firsthand experiencing all these things? And is it visual, meaning when the character, are we seeing things through the character's eyes? So for example, in a scene with two people, the scene is about much more than the dialogue. It's about everything that the protagonist perceives and takes in. There's a really quick, silly little experiment I always like to offer when you're watching a movie or a TV show. Watch a scene with the sound close your eyes, watch the scene, and just listen to it. And then rewind it, watch it again, and this time turn the sound off, but just watch it and see how much richer and fuller and how much more you get out of the scene from the visuals. We're a visual creature, humans, and that is how we take in so much information on an animal level, where we're picking up, just like dogs do, or picking up on body language, gesture, tiny little facial expressions, reactions, and all of that affects how we react and then how we act. So see if you can make sure in your stories you are plunging us so deeply into your protagonist's perspective that we are them. We are feeling those things. We are seeing what they see. We're living it with them firsthand, visually and viscerally. All right, number 2, plot but no story. These are slightly different. Action is not plot, for starters. I'll talk about plot and story in a minute, but action is stuff happening. That doesn't make it a plot. In this scene, for example, you can see there's lots going on. There's people moving, there's people looking at something, the board, there are interactions, there are people in a hurry, people standing still, people going different directions, but nothing's happening. We don't know what this means. It's just stuff happening. So check your story to make sure that you don't just have a bunch of interesting things, because that creates an episodic feel to your story. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. What makes it plot is that it is in service to the story. So plot itself is not story. Plot is so if your character is, story is point A, character's at a point A, they wind up at a point B, and they go on a journey that directly brings about that change. That's story. Plot is the middle part. It's the journey. But what makes it story is the point A and point B. So you have to make sure that all these things are tied together. You need to create events. Here, I think I have it up here. No, I don't. We'll get to that in a minute. You have to create events that lead your character from her point A to her point B, and you have to, every step on that journey has to be essential for reaching that destination. And then the last thing I put up here is that every story needs a central story question. A lot of times what I see keeps a manuscript from being as effective as it could is that we don't know what that central story question is. Basically, that is, why are we reading? What are we trying? What do we need to find out? In something like The Hunger Games, it's, will Katniss survive the Hunger Games? And then the big picture of the series, will she be able to overthrow, what's his name? Donald Sutherland. And that's the main question. Now, there's lots of other little story questions that are sort of like mini arcs that'll happen within the story, but we need to know why we are turning the pages. I'm going to go ahead and click because I've got 2 examples on here that are good for story question. And we'll talk about it again in a second. Or right now, as that is the first bullet point. What is the reason that we're reading? What big picture outcome is in question? That's your story question. We have to know because it's what keeps us turning the pages. This is across any genre. So I put 2 up here that are a little bit different genres. One's kind of, I guess they're both women's fiction-y, but the one on the left is more romance. The one on the right is more sort of literary, kind of upmarket. Let's start with Catherine Center's How to Walk Away. This is the story of a woman who she thinks she has everything that she wants in life. She has a perfect career. She's engaged to the love of her life. And then he takes her up in a plane. She has an accident and she becomes paralyzed. And she's in the hospital for most of the story, trying to learn whether she will walk again. So the central story question in her case is, how does someone lose everything by which they measured a successful, fulfilling life and still have one? Will she be able to do that? That's why we continue reading and follow her journey. In An American Marriage, it's about a couple is traveling, sort of an upwardly mobile, successful, young, very much in love couple. And when they stay overnight at a hotel, he is wrongfully accused of rape and he goes to jail for, I think, 7 years. And she obviously carries on with her life, even though they are still in love. They're trying to do the best they can to make it work, but he's wrongfully imprisoned for this length of time. So the central story question is, will they survive as a couple? Again, within each of these stories, there's a lot of other stuff going on, but that's the big picture, and we need to know what that is. Ask yourself, what's the protagonist's journey to that destination? So I'm going to go ahead and put the next one up because they go together. I did the point A, point B, and the little arc. That's your character arc. What's the journey to the destination is how your character finds basically the answer to that question. So we need to see with every single step that moves your character along that path. Anything that doesn't is extraneous. And that's the next bullet point. Does every single development help move your character along that arc? This is where you're going to have to kill some darlings because this is most often where they appear. When you have a great scene or a great character or some wonderful bit of dialogue or exchange, but it is not serving to propel your character toward that destination, that's when your plot starts to get muddy or meander. The dangers of not creating a cohesive plot that does this thing I was talking about is that you might have lots of things happening, but they don't all relate to the destination. That's when you get sort of that episodic feeling, or you can get just kind of a too many things happening feeling where you overwhelm the reader. Or we don't see movement along the arc, so you've got a character that kind of treads water and they're not going forward. Or we see detours that take us off the main path that, again, maybe, I have broken my own heart suggesting that authors take certain things out of the story, but if they're not serving that central story, they are hampering your story. Okay, I'm going to get moving because I've only got like 30 minutes and I'm already halfway through it. Number 3, low stakes. Your protagonist has to desperately want something, and they have to be in danger, and that has to be something that they enormously care about. So they either have to want this thing or be in danger of losing it, or or be trying to avoid something perhaps, but it has to be incredibly important to them. We only care as much as your character cares. So that's why you can have a story like, I can't think of a specific example, but if you've ever watched something where big stuff, a lot of like action adventure movies, big stuff is happening, life and death stuff, but you're kind of unmoved by it. If we don't relate to the character and the character doesn't desperately want that thing, it doesn't matter how high the stakes are, we're not going to care. And then conversely, you can have just the tiniest little. There was a movie called Aquila and the Bee that I loved, and it was about a little girl who wanted to win a spelling bee. Could the stakes be smaller? But they were not small to her, and that's the key. She cared enormously about it. And that brings us to our next bullet point. It's more than what's at risk for a character. Yes, stakes are often, high stakes can be like life and death, success or failure, big stuff like that. But that is not what creates meaningful stakes in and of itself. It is what that means to a character. As I say, don't think in terms of adding stuff when you want to build high stakes. Think in terms of layering in more meaning. If you just keep adding stuff, that's when you can get into melodrama or telenovela territory, where you've got all this exciting stuff happening, but it can start to feel a little overwhelming or even comical if it's done too heavily handed. But think in terms of adding more meaning. So you've got this little girl who wants to win the spelling bee, for example. Why is that important to her? Or you've got, let's say, a woman. I don't know. I used to be an actor, and I always say this. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got was that great actors make the strongest possible choices. So if, let's say, you have a woman who's leaving her husband because she's fallen in love with someone else, how can you raise the stakes on that? Well, maybe she's pregnant. Yeah, maybe so. That is good. It does raise the stakes. But maybe it's just that she also still loves her husband. Maybe it's that she also doesn't want to break up the family because she has a special needs child who doesn't do well with just one parent. Maybe she is financially unable to make it on her own. Maybe she doesn't know if she can trust her new lover. These are small little stakes, but they layer in meaning, and they layer in why something is important to a character in a way that really raises the stakes up and makes your character care more, and thus us care more if we're invested in the character. So here are some questions to ask yourself. This is a novel by Ruta Sepetys that I absolutely love. It's set in Franco's fascist Spain, and it's again really character driven. It's high stakes, and it's basically two characters, one of whom, well, here, what does your character want desperately? So Daniel, the male lead, desperately wants to be a photojournalist. He goes to Spain with his ambassador father, who wants him to take over their oil business instead. So he has this conflict. What does Anna want? That's his the female protagonist. She is a Spanish native. She is living in Franco's fascist Spain. She's working at a hotel that caters to American tourists and ambassadors and business people, and they're very invested. This is where the title comes from, in presenting a certain face of Spain that hides the grim realities of what it's like to live in this autocratic, very oppressive society. She wants to break free of that desperately. She comes to want Daniel. She wants to save her family from just abject poverty. She wants to escape the constant danger of living in this society. So you've got these really strong motivations that continue to be complicated throughout the story, and stakes continue to rise. She is literally risking her life by telling Daniel some of these things. Daniel is risking his entire future and his life because they are in Spain, and he will be also subject to the same punishments. But also they become more and more important to each other. We meet their families. We understand what's important to them, what drives them. Again, it's all interconnected, and that raises the stakes. Why does your character want it? That will also help you raise the stakes. If you have a character who, let's say, wants to save the family farm, Why does your character want to do that? So examine whether you've made the highest stakes choice there too. Because it's been in the family for years and she doesn't want to lose it. Okay, well, we can see that that's important, like heritage means something, but it's not really life or death. It doesn't back your character into a corner. If the worst happened, it would be sad, but not devastating. How can you make it devastating? Maybe this is where she's known the only happiness in her entire life. Maybe this was the only safe place in her entire life. Maybe she has 3 kids and they're growing up in this beautiful, happy place that she spent her happy childhood, and they have nowhere to go if they get evicted. I'm, again, making all this up off the top of my head, and you can probably think of more, but think of increasing the drive and the motivation for your character to attain that goal as a way of also raising the stakes. What does he stand to gain by succeeding or lose by failing? This is the consequences, and they have to be dire. There has to be something really meaningful at stake, and the consequences for failing to achieve it or achieving it must be essential to this character's whatever, happiness, whatever their arc is, whatever their point B is. This thing that they need is essential to achieving that. And what makes it urgent? This is something I see often. An author will have all these other pieces in place, but if it's not urgent, if it's not urgent right now that this thing happened, the story lacks that high stakes feeling and momentum. So what makes it crucial that this happen now? Let's say we go back to the family farm and the bank is trying to foreclose on it right now. Or, I don't know, she's pregnant, and I'm making things up. She's pregnant and she has to stay in the house because, a fortune teller told her that if her child was born somewhere else, it would have a short, miserable life. I'm making it all up. But find a reason why this story has to happen right now, why your character is forced onto this path right now, and that will heighten stakes enormously and keep readers staying deeply invested. Okay, lack of forward momentum. I've mentioned it a little bit as we go. This is a big one. Every single scene has to move your story forward. I talked about that in the plot section, where everything that happens has to serve to push your character closer to the goal, but also realize there will also be setbacks. But every single scene must propel them in some way along that arc. This is different from pace. Pace and momentum are often used interchangeably, but the way that I explain them is that momentum is a function of story, pace is a function of scene. Meaning, let's say you're driving across country, momentum is that you never stop driving toward California or wherever you're going. It's your constant forward movement toward that destination. Pace is how fast you're driving. Pace is also important, but not as important as momentum. If your story stops moving forward, your reader will put the story down. The agent will put your manuscript down. So you have to consistently propel and compel them. By propel, I mean keep them moving. By compel, I mean force them to keep moving onward through the story. How do you do that? There are so many different ways that you can increase momentum, but the most important thing to keep in mind is, actually, I'm going to show you in the next slide. So first I'll tell you why you need to do it. Because you will stall out your pace, you'll let your tension drop, the momentum will flag, and that's when the reader puts your story down. So here are the questions to ask yourself. How does every single scene lead directly to the next? South Park has this technique I love. They call it the but therefore technique. Basically, every single scene they check to make sure that in an episode of South Park, every single scene is connected to the next one with either the word but or therefore, meaning it is an obstacle in the way of the thing that the characters want, or it is a natural result of the last thing the characters did. If the words that connect the scenes are and then, you have an episodic story and you've lost your forward momentum. So how does each scene directly push us along that arc? I always put up Da Vinci Code because say what you want about Dan Brown. He is a master at keeping you turning the pages. How does he do that? He asks questions. He leaves things unresolved. He creates tension. He drops breadcrumbs. He creates mysteries. He maintains suspense. He keeps us guessing. And if you can do that, if we have to know what happens next, basically, how does your character get to where we want them to go, then you have your reader hooked. One thing I always like to say with him is pick up this book or any of his books, read the last couple of paragraphs of every chapter and notice how he consistently does that. He forces you to ask a question or leave something unresolved that compels you to keep reading. How does every scene directly result from the one preceding it? That's the but therefore thing I just talked about. Does each progression, each step on the path, logically follow? Is it inevitable from the previous step on the path so that we're seeing a constant progression toward the destination? And is every single scene essential to move the story forward? I mentioned this earlier too. Here are the things that make a scene essential. It has to develop the character, meaning push them farther along their arc. It has to propel the plot. It has to raise stakes, or it has to reveal new and essential information. The strongest stories do some combination of most or all of these in every single scene. Okay, number 5, lack of suspense and tension. Like pace and momentum, these are not quite the same thing. And also like pace and momentum, suspense is a function of story, I always think of it. Tension is a function of scene. Or you can think of it as suspense creates a question. Tension creates an obstacle or friction or conflict. Or another way to look at it is that suspense is the uncertainty to whatever the outcome will be, and tension is all the ingredients that create that uncertainty. So I always say suspense is boy meets girl, will boy get girl? And tension is the little chewy boy loses girl filling. It's all the things that happen on the way to answering that question. Suspense and tension both rely on having high stakes. If we don't care, then you can't make us care by wondering what's going to happen next or creating obstacles to that thing. They are almost always specific and concrete, not broad and general. So a lot of times I'll hear authors say, what does your character want? What's the story question? Oh, they want to be happy. That's really broad and really general, and I don't know what it means. As a reader, I don't know what to root for because that's very generic. I need something specific. What does happiness look like? She wants to find love and have a family. He wants to keep the bad guy from shooting his family. I don't know. Whatever that thing is, make it very granular and concrete and specific. And it's visceral, not intellectual. You can tell us all day long about how scary and suspenseful something is, but unless we feel that, suspense and tension happen here, not here. You can create it from here, but you have to elicit this visceral reaction in your readers with it. So I like this picture because the suspense in this picture is that guy gonna fall? That's the question. The tension would be gravity, his balance. Maybe somebody watching him might make him tense, or somebody, trying to distract him. Maybe his own thoughts are distracting him. All those things are the tension. Here are the questions you can ask yourself. These are 2 stories that I deliberately chose because one is actually a suspense thriller. The other one is more like a women's fiction. So this suspense and tension are essential no matter what your genre is. I could have put up any genre here and it's equally true, including nonfiction. Do you keep raising questions in the reader's mind throughout the story? Meaning, what do we need to keep reading to find out? Are there opposing forces that keep your protagonist from what they want in every scene and on every page? And I used to say on every line, but then I thought maybe that was militant. But really, the more little opposing forces you can bring in, the higher the tension and the more readable and suspenseful and intriguing and engaging the story is. Here's some ways you can do that. By tension on every page, tension in every line, I don't mean someone needs to get hit or there needs to be a fight or there needs to be shouting. There's so many different types of tension you can create. Subtle and overt. Subtle tension would be, overt tension would be like a punch in the face. Subtle tension would be two men are fighting over the bill, and one says, I got it, and the other one goes, I got it. And the first one says, I said, I've got it. We're seeing this same cockfight between these two, but it's not a punch in the face. Internal and external. External tension is the punch, the dynamic between the two guys I was just talking about. Internal tension might be one of them is really insecure and he's short and the other guy's really tall and it makes him nervous. So that's an internal tension. He's trying to kind of push past that. Or it could be an internal tension could be like a character is fighting a personal demon like alcoholism. It could be a fear. It could be the wound. And direct and indirect. Direct would be something like a slap in the face. Indirect is somebody puts out their hand to shake it and the person walks away. So make sure you're just weaving in that kind of friction. That friction is what makes us invested in the story. It's what makes us keep wanting to know what happens next because we're seeing something keeping the character from the thing that they want. All right, I put up a bonus number 6 because this is a really important one and I couldn't keep it to 5. Being generic rather than being specific. I touched on this a little bit earlier. The way that you appeal universally to readers is by being as specific as you can. You want to give us these itty bitty little details that bring something to life that make us know and relate to these characters and their journey in a way that we will extrapolate to our own reality and then we will relate to it. I always use an example of the book Be Frank With Me by Julia Claiborne Johnson. It's about it's not a big story. It's about a woman who winds up taking care of a boy who I think he's on the spectrum, and the thing she wants is his happiness. So it's this really specific story that doesn't relate. We may not have that same experience, but she makes it so specific to the character that we relate to it on that universal level. Or The Rosie Project by Graham Sinsian, I think, is a story about another person on the spectrum, a scientist who wants to find a wife. That's a really specific goal. It's a really specific character. Why do we relate to that? Because of the specificity, because it's so granular, as I mentioned before, that we know those characters and we care about them and we relate to them. And as readers, we will bring that to our own experience. We'll draw those parallels. The example I always use is if and this applies to everything. It applies to description. Don't tell me there's a tree. Tell me what the tree is. So let's say I talk about a character looking at a Monet. I might mean any of these, and that's a pretty wide variety. So then I say, no, it's a water lily Monet. I might mean any of these or more than 200 others. If I want you to see what I'm seeing or what the character is seeing, I have to be dead specific. And let's take this the top right one. I would say it's predominantly blues and it's got a little white in the corner that lightens up the scene, and there's water lilies, and that's all there is in the scene. It's just water lilies on water with a little reflection of the clouds in the sky. Now maybe you start to see the exact painting I'm talking about, but if I just say a Monet, you're not living this story in a way that feels real and dynamic and direct. That's it. It's really hard to keep to 30 minutes, and it didn't, but anyone who's been in my classes knows that that's not a thing I usually do. Again, I'm Tiffany Yates Martin. My company is Fox Print Editorial. I just released a book called Intuitive Editing. If any of this intrigues you, I go into a ton more depth in the book. And it's based around questions like this. I guide you through asking yourself the right questions of your story so that you can deepen and develop these things as much as possible on your own and get the objectivity that an editor brings to your work. I've put up my socials here. You can link to the book on my website. You can link to online courses that I offer. I have a free one up right now that teaches you how to analyze story. So you can watch movies, television, books, and learn how to deepen your understanding of storycraft and get objectivity on someone else's work. It's so much easier than trying to do it on your own, and see some of these things in action. And I've got Facebook up here, and also Fox Print Ed is my Twitter and my Instagram, I think. Or maybe Instagram is Tiffany Yates Martin. Anyway, I'm sorry not to be with you this year. I'm so glad to get to connect with you this way. Please feel free to reach out, and take care of yourselves.